Building off of Paul Bohannon's work from 1955, Alf Hornberg in 2007 writes, "Learning from the TIV, why a sustainable economy would have to be multicentric." Hornberg notes that to pave the way for industrial capitalism, the ideology and science of economics made unequal exchange of labor and land invisible by conditioning us, in a broader general sense, to think only in terms of money. He does note that there have been a number of attempts to look at how alternative exchange systems can be put into play. These are local exchange trading systems. Here you can see examples from the so-called Rainbow Coast, the northwest coast of Australia. There have been examples in the United States, such as in Gainesville, Florida, as well as in Ithaca, New York. Alf Hornborg notes that the current agricultural policies could be replaced with a system wherein it was rational for humans to practice sustainable production as well as consumption. And we do see some of these policies occurring, at least in terms of the electronic benefits cards that can be utilized, or what has been formerly the food stamps program, being utilized in places like farmers markets and potentially CSA, or community supported agriculture operations. Switching scales a little bit, Eugene Hun in 1999 in the book Ethnoecology, Situated Knowledge, Local Lives, which is edited by Virginia Nazarea, argues for the value of subsistence practices for the future of the world as a whole. And he discusses the importance of so-called fourth world societies. And these are societies or institutions, these are societies which are in the larger governments, such as Native American nations within the United States or First Peoples within Canada. Indeed, indigenous peoples across the globe would comprise so-called fourth world societies. Hun talks about traditional ecological knowledge. This has also been called traditional knowledge or indigenous ecological knowledge or indigenous knowledge. Hun argues that teak embodies the cultural diversity of the species as a whole, and that it is essential for the survival of our species as a whole. In this way, he looks at traditional ecological knowledge in terms of its broader implications in larger society. This idea of scaling up traditional ecological knowledge from local embedded knowledge and what it can possibly tell us about the future, about ways of interacting with the environment for long-term sustainability in a given ecological region. He draws the parallel of the destruction of cultural diversity, biological diversity, and linguistic diversity, which are all essential components in forming traditional ecological knowledge in a given area. And he draws the parallel that it is akin to burning of a library. In the cultural sense, he notes that we may be left with just one culture, one way of examining or looking at the world. This is the global capitalist consumer society. Of course, from anthropological studies of globalization, we also see a diversity of approaches with globalization in terms of what is actually occurring, that it is not merely a trend or movement towards uniformity, but also this idea of increased and intensified interactions with so-called others in having the potential to create new cultural spaces for interaction. Nevertheless, traditional ecological knowledge is place-based, and it builds off of long-term residents in the area of multiple generations, passing on knowledge of ecology and environment through things like oral histories and traditions to the next generation. Hun continues on, noting that the continued existence of subsistence-based communities represents choices for our future. And this directly counters the idea that there is no alternative, that one must engage with the capitalist system of production in one particular way. So at an individual level, even, this offers some sense of liberation or some source of potential for at least conceiving that there are other choices or other potentialities that exist within our lifetime, ways of making a living ways of engaging with not only making a living in terms of economics, but a livelihood that is reflective of not only economics, but also the connection between morality, ethics, and economics as a whole. Hun follows Marx in noting that the root of our present predicament lies in the mass alienation of human beings from the work of subsistence on their own land. And so in a certain sense, Hun is looking at this as a potential for a populist movement, a return to the land. Of course, there have been many of these movements that have occurred within the United States with a variety of results in terms of their overall success. To scale up a little bit, if we're thinking about society as a whole, one of the things that we often do not have to think about is where our food is coming from. And this is explicitly what Hun is talking about in terms of alienation, following Marx. And we also see this in the context of energy. Turning on the lights, turning on the computer, listening on whatever device you're listening on right now. I mean, all of these things require energy not only to run them, but energy that's embedded within the particular object, all the energy that it took to make, create, ship the product to you so that you can use it now to listen to this lecture, for example. And this is a larger question. So, this becomes an issue of the idea of scaling things up. On a really large scale, we can look at the production of energy. Energy, in a real simple sense, is the ability to do work. The future energy economies across the globe, we're seeing much discussion along the idea of transition in terms of energy futures from a post-fossil fuel era. There have been much discussions along the lines of peak oil and the subsequent rises in the prices of oil that have existed fairly continuously throughout the past decade or so. Of course, we see that there are trends in terms of the oil supply and glut, such as the embargo in the 1970s that led to long lines within the United States. So many countries are coming up with different energy strategies on how to meet the needs of the future. And many of these planners are assuming that there is going to be an intensification in the amount of energy that is needed. And so with this assumption, they go in having to essentially create more energy from some source. Nuclear has been promoted as a viable alternative by individuals across the globe. Many of these have been associated with the nuclear industry as well as industry in general. In the context of Japan, we see from Ogawa's work that before the accident at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant, nuclear power provided 30% of the electricity of Japan with 54 nuclear reactors that were operating. Plans were in the works pre-disaster at Fukushima for over 50% of the energy demands of Japan to be met by 2030 by nuclear power. There have been a number of proponents of the continuation of expansion of nuclear power within Japan, even post-Fukushima, after the Fukushima accident. These are what are referred to as the nuclear village in Japan. That nuclear energy is in fact necessary to maintain the economic prosperity of Japan as a whole. And so nuclear power becomes key or cornerstone in even getting to any potential future for the nuclear village. Ogawa discusses anti-nuclear rallies in the summer of 2012 in Japan. He notes that these rallies are marked by generally peaceful and orderly behavior, with individuals dispersing when the rally is over. Relatively little in terms of direct conflict with the police in terms of civil disobedience. However, one of the things that Ogawa notes is that the numbers of protesters have been consistently underestimated by police and official reports. And I think that there's definitely something telling to this in terms of the number of people who are actually showing up to protest particular events or occurrences. Much of the discussion from those that are rallying against nuclear power is thinking about the energy in the sense of energy futures in a different light, and that the primary importance might not necessarily be to maintain the level of consumption, or indeed accelerate the level of consumption to attain happiness, but protect the future in a broader sense, protecting children from the potential of nuclear radiation. And this is one of the chants that Ogawa noticed in the context of these protests. Ogawa also noticed that there were individuals that were anti-protesters. They were essentially protesting the protesters. Some of the activists alleged that they were hired by TEPCO, the Tokyo Electric Power Company, who called the protesters essentially unpatriotic to Japan. And this was associated with a term that was used during World War II to refer to people who criticized national policies. The movement as a whole calls for a switch to renewables in terms of the future energy economy, and how much of that can actually be made in terms of renewables is certainly up for question and debate, but ultimately it also might mean making some sacrifices and really considering what is actually needed in order to maintain life, in order to maintain a good and satisfactory way of life. Do we have to, in fact, make choices to prioritize the value of life in relation to our ability to expend energy, for example? And this question really ties into a lot of the work that I've looked at in the context of Chernobyl. In my 2012 film, Chernobyl's Power, Transforming Lives and Fueling the Future, I look at the continuing impacts of the accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant and its implications for the future energy production in Ukraine in terms of whether nuclear power would still play a key role in that. And of course, there's much debate and contention in Japan as well as in Ukraine along these lines. Some of the things that really stood out to me in the film, and I think speak to some of the larger issues that we talked about over the course of the class, would be Elvira Zlobina's comments, two comments that she had actually. First, about the availability of scientific information for the safety of the general public. That is, that you have all this knowledge that's created in a scientific sense, but how much of that is actually disseminated to the population as a whole? How is it utilized to actually transform the lives of individuals for them to make informed and educated decisions? And so here we get to the fundamental disconnects potentially between scientific knowledge, public policy, and then individual or community perceptions overall. And this is, of course, one of the places where cultural anthropology can begin to enter some of these debates and discussions and improve the lines of communication along these differently situated actors. Elvira Zlobina also talks about the foreclosure of particular events, the idea that you have a crisis event that occurs at one point in time, that at that moment in time, this is what mobilizes so much interest in the event. This is where people, resources, skills are being brought to bear on a particular crisis. But then what happens after the crisis is over? Where is all of the response post-crisis? At least, and how exactly is crisis defined? And indeed, I think that there's a lesson to be learned here, at least in terms of how we define crises or how we define problems, and then how those are actually met or confronted overall. Finally, much as in Ogawa's work in Japan post-Fukushima Daiichi, we see that post-Chernobyl in Ukraine, both Valery Galeko and Eric Korzylowska talk very specifically about a hope for a better world for our children, and so that we all may have the future. And I'd like to leave you with that thought overall in this class, that hopefully some of the things that we've conveyed in this class have allowed you to more critically analyze information that you're receiving from a variety of sources to really get to the root of what problems are, and then what is the frame in which you're considering solving those problems as well.